Iran is in the middle of a revolution. What started as protests over a collapsing economy has turned into the largest anti-government uprising in decades, with people demanding the end of the Islamic Republic itself. But this isn't just a crisis for Iran. It's also China's worst nightmare. Because Iran isn't just another country China trades with. It's China's closest partner in the Middle East and one of its most important oil suppliers. And now the US and Israel are openly backing the protesters. Trump announced fresh tariffs on anyone who does business with Iran and warned that military action is on the table. All of this is putting the China-Iran relationship under serious pressure. But the real question is, what happens next? Not just for Iran, but for the balance of power between the US and China. Let's start with what's happening on the ground in Iran. For years, Iran's economy has been under strain. International sanctions have limited oil sales and cut the country off from the global economy. Economic mismanagement made things worse. Their currency has collapsed and food prices jumped 70% in a single year. By December 28th last year, the pressure exploded into the streets. The protests spread like wildfire across all 31 provinces, including many smaller cities. And as they spread, the message started to change. What began as anger over prices quickly turned into something more political. People started criticizing the leadership itself and calling for its collapse. Real power in Iran sits with the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who controls the courts, state media and security forces. And according to multiple videos, protesters have been chanting death to the supreme leader. In several cities, crowds were filmed pulling down statues of senior military figures linked to the government. In others, images of the supreme leader were burned in the streets. They weren't just protesting about the economy anymore. They wanted the whole regime gone. The government responded quickly. Going off publicly available news reports, it looks like security forces loyal to the supreme leader moved in to suppress the protests, using live ammo in some cases. At the same time, authorities imposed a near-total internet blackout. Because of that, exact numbers are hard to confirm. But according to human rights groups, more than 2,500 protesters have died and more than 18,000 have been arrested. That's insane considering the protests have only been going on for a few weeks. We can't verify those numbers, but many analysts now describe this as the most dangerous moment for Iran's leadership in decades. Not because the regime is guaranteed to fall, that's far from certain, but because the scale of the protests is unlike anything seen in recent decades. And the government is resorting to extreme violence to suppress them. There's one more factor that makes this crisis especially unstable. The supreme leader Khamenei is 86 years old and his health is failing. And there's no clear successor. The person who was expected to replace him, President Ibrahim Raisi, died in a helicopter crash in May 2024. That means if something happened to the current supreme leader, no one knows who takes over, or whether that transition would be peaceful. And for China, which has deep ties to this current regime, that uncertainty is a problem. Where this whole situation goes from here is still uncertain, but it's no longer just an internal Iranian crisis. As the unrest escalates, Iran's enemies are starting to take advantage of the situation. The US and Israel, both long-time enemies of Iran, have openly voiced support for the protesters.
And by the way, to all Iranian patriots, keep protesting, take over your institutions if possible. And all I say to them is help is on its way.
Trump has already begun escalating pressure and has put the possibility of military action on the table. And as we saw in Venezuela, Trump has shown he's willing to follow through on that. For China, the survival of Iran's current regime is really important to its economic and strategic interests in the Middle East, which makes this crisis really complicated. Because when the US talks about putting pressure on Iran, it's not just talking about the government. On January 12, Trump announced fresh tariffs on any country that continues doing business with Iran. On paper, that sounds really broad. In reality, it's very targeted. Right now, China is essentially Iran's economic lifeline. Because of sanctions, almost every major economy has stopped buying Iranian oil. China is the main exception. According to shipping data, around 80 to 90% of Iran's oil exports now go to China. That means the Iranian government is heavily dependent on China for revenue, especially at the moment when its economy is already under extreme stress. But the dependence runs both ways. Iranian oil makes up roughly 15% of China's total crude oil imports. Even though China buys oil from many countries, that's still an amount you can't easily replace, especially because China gets to buy the oil at a huge discount, usually $8 to $10 below the market price. That really matters because it helps China keep energy costs down and keep its manufacturing-based economy running. So when Trump raises tariffs on Iran's trade partners, he's essentially targeting China. If China stops buying Iranian oil, Iran's government loses its main source of income almost immediately. But if China keeps buying, it risks facing economic retaliation from the US. In practice, the US is testing whether China is willing to keep paying the price for their relationship. Iran is one of the few countries in the region willing to maintain deep political and economic ties with China even under intense US pressure. Over the years, China hasn't just been buying oil from Iran. It's made a long-term strategic bet on the current regime staying in power. In 2021, the two countries signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership. Under that agreement, China pledged up to $400 billion in long-term investments in areas like transport, telecommunications, banking, and energy infrastructure. Much of it is tied to state-owned companies closely linked to the current Iranian regime. Iran is also very critical to China because of its location. Most of China's trade travels by ship through choke points the US Navy could disrupt in a crisis, like a conflict over Taiwan. An overland corridor through Iran gives China a backup route to move goods and energy across Europe and Asia if sea routes are blocked. And all of that planning rests on one assumption, that the current Iranian government remains in place. If this regime collapses and if a new government emerges that tries to be more friendly with the West, China doesn't just lose access to discounted oil, it risks losing billions of dollars in long-term investments. More importantly, it risks losing a key overland trade corridor. And it risks losing one of the few partners in the Middle East that's aligned with China against the US. That's why the current crisis in Iran is such a problem for China. Because this isn't just a domestic uprising in a distant country, it's happening in a place where China has tied together its energy, security, and regional strategy, and its long-term plans for competing with the US. At the same time, Iran is facing growing pressure from its enemies. Trump has repeatedly warned that tougher options are on the table if the crackdown on protesters continues, including military action. Unlike in places like Venezuela, the US doesn't have a large military force positioned right next to Iran that it can easily rely on, but doesn't necessarily need to, because the US has a close ally in the region that does. Israel has openly voiced support for the protesters, and it has a long and successful track record of acting directly against Iran when it sees an opening. In 2018, Israeli agents broke into a Tehran warehouse and smuggled out 50,000 pages of nuclear files. In 2020, they assassinated Iran's top nuclear scientist. And in June 2025, Israeli airstrikes killed over 30 Iranian generals and 11 nuclear scientists. All of this show that when Israel decides the moment is right, it has the capability to act and penetrate whatever defenses Iran has. So from China's perspective, this crisis can easily spiral out of control. Iran is under internal pressure from mass protests, economic pressure from the US sanctions and tariffs, and the real threat of external military intervention all at the same time. And China is deeply tied to the survival of the current Iranian regime, which puts them in an uncomfortable position because it has a lot to lose if Iran falls. Given how much China has invested in Iran, you would expect them to be doing something to protect their investment. And technically, they are, just not very much. And what they're doing isn't working. Publicly, China has issued the usual diplomatic statements. They called for restraint and respect for sovereignty and warned against foreign interference. These are just standard diplomatic language that doesn't really commit China to anything concrete. Behind the scenes, China has been trying to keep Iran's economy afloat. It's kept buying oil, even increasing its purchases slightly to give Iran some more cash flow. It's continuing with its infrastructure projects. But all of that isn't very useful for solving this crisis. Buying more oil at a discount isn't taking risks for Iran. It's just taking advantage of the current situation. And when Trump announced those 25% tariffs recently, China's lack of any strong response tells you everything. Because the reality is this: last year, official trade between China and the US was nearly $660 billion. Meanwhile, China's official trade with Iran is only about $12 billion. Even if you include the estimated $40 billion in under-the-table oil sales that China doesn't report to avoid sanctions, the US market is still more than 10 times larger than Iran's. That's the calculation China is making when it decides not to do anything to help Iran. And we have seen this exact playbook before with Venezuela. China had also invested billions there, backed the government in public, bought their oil. But when the US escalated and ultimately captured their President Maduro, China couldn't and wouldn't do anything. Not because Venezuela didn't matter, but because the cost of confronting the US outweighed the benefits. The same logic applies here. Despite the talk of strategic partnership, the China-Iran relationship is at its core transactional. China prioritizes its own interests over loyalty to its partners. That's why their response so far has been limited to statements and warnings, but nothing that would actually put China at risk. China can buy oil, it can invest, it can talk, but it won't fight. And it certainly won't risk its trade relationship with the US to save its partner, which means Iran is essentially on its own, and the pressure keeps building. So where does this go from here? There are really only a few ways this can end. The first possibility, and honestly the most common one historically, is that the current regime survives through sheer force and repression. The protests are eventually crushed through arrest, violence, and fear. The leadership stays in place, but the country comes out weaker. Sanctions will continue, inflation stays high, and the government relies even more heavily on its security forces and surveillance to stay in control. For Iranians, it's the most depressing outcome. Nothing really changes, except that speaking out against the government becomes even more dangerous. The second possibility is that something breaks from the top. Here's the thing about regimes like Iran's: protests alone rarely topple them. What usually breaks them is a shock to the leadership itself. That shock could come from within, like a military coup, but that's unlikely in Iran. The Revolutionary Guards, which is a security force separate from the military, effectively control the country and are fiercely loyal to the supreme leader. They have too much to lose if the regime falls. So the real threat will have to come from the outside. As the unrest drags on, and the regime uses more violence, the US and especially Israel could decide this is an opportunity for them. Because the more Iran represses its people, the more public support there would be for them intervening. But instead of a full invasion, they would probably do something precise and targeted, like an operation to remove the supreme leader Khamenei himself, something like Venezuela. Trump has openly discussed very strong options. Israel has a proven track record of conducting operations inside Iran. If a supreme leader and his inner circle were suddenly taken away or assassinated, the regime could quickly collapse. But Iran currently has no unified opposition ready to take over. So what would likely follow is chaos and internal power struggles. The economy might be paralyzed from the instability until a new government can take over. For China, this is a nightmare scenario. Its oil deals, infrastructure projects, and long-term agreements are all built on relationships with the current regime. A new government, especially one seeking better relations with the West, may want to freeze or cancel those deals. For Iranians, this path carries real hope, but also real danger. The end of the regime could open the door to a different future. But the transition itself will be painful and unpredictable. And here's a harsh reality. Overthrowing regimes in the Middle East rarely leads to something better. Egypt had its Arab Spring and ended up with a military dictatorship. Iraq descended into chaos after Saddam Hussein fell. Libya collapsed into a civil war after Gaddafi was killed. So it's far from a guarantee that the lives of regular Iranians will improve. Now, you might be wondering about a third possibility, that the regime could reform itself, bring in more moderate people into its leadership, ease the restrictions, offer some concessions to calm things down, and slowly but surely change for the better. But honestly, that's extremely unlikely, because the protesters aren't asking for reform. They're demanding the end of the Islamic Republic itself. And those in power who control the security forces have shown zero interest in compromise. Their response has been violence, not negotiation. Once you have killed hundreds or thousands of people, you can't really walk that back with reforms. So realistically, it comes down to those first two paths: status quo or the leadership being removed via foreign intervention. And while great powers scheme how to benefit most from the situation, it's Iranian families who are stuck living through the consequences. Unfortunately, there is no clean ending here, just different versions of pain. Ultimately, this is a crisis that will reshape Iran's future, China's position in the Middle East, and the broader power struggle between the US and China. And we actually saw a similar situation play out recently in Venezuela. If you want to learn how that crisis unfolded and how it affected the balance of power between the US and China, check out this video right here.